Why did you push him? Suga's voice cut through the noise, low but unmistakably angry. For a second, even the roaring arena seemed to disappear. Jimin was on the stage floor, one hand pressed against the cold surface, his breathing uneven as thousands of fans stared in stunned silence. Jungkook stood only a few steps away, frozen, his face drained of color. Then Suga moved toward Jimin, and something in his expression changed. This was no longer about a performance. It was about what had just happened between them. But what the audience couldn't see was the reason Jimin had fallen, and why. Moments later, Suga would struggle to hold back his tears. Was Jungkook really the one to blame? Or had everyone misunderstood what happened? What do you think really happened? Tell us in the comments before we reveal the truth.
The moment before the fall had begun hours earlier, long before the lights came on and thousands of voices filled the venue. It was late afternoon, and the backstage corridors were already alive with the restless energy of a concert night. Crew members moved quickly between equipment cases, radios crackled with short instructions, dancers stretched beneath harsh white work lights, and somewhere beyond the concrete walls, the audience was beginning to chant. Jimin stood near a narrow backstage monitor, watching the empty stage being transformed into something enormous. The floor reflected rows of blue and violet lights, while technicians tested microphones and moving platforms one by one. He looked calm, but Suga, standing several meters behind him, noticed the way Jimin kept rubbing his palms together. "Nervous?" Suga asked. Jimin glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Not nervous, just thinking." "That's usually when you should be nervous," Suga replied dryly. Jimin laughed quietly, but the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Tonight was supposed to be another performance, another carefully rehearsed sequence in a life where almost every second was planned. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different. Earlier that afternoon, the members had gathered in a private rehearsal room for a final run-through. RM reviewed the schedule with the staff, Jin joked with the dancers, J-Hope checked the choreography, and V sat quietly in a corner listening to the instrumental tracks through his headphones. Jungkook repeatedly practiced one particular transition, moving across the floor with intense concentration. "Again," he said to himself after missing the timing by less than a second. Jimin watched him from the side. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor." Jungkook smiled. "Then I'll blame the floor." Their laughter briefly softened the room. Suga remained near the sound console, observing everything without saying much. He had always been good at noticing details other people missed, the hesitation before someone spoke, the forced smile, the silence that lasted a little too long. When rehearsal ended, Jimin stayed behind. "You coming?" Suga asked. "In a minute." "Don't stay too long." Jimin nodded, but when Suga walked away, he looked back once. Jimin was still standing alone beneath the rehearsal lights, staring at the stage floor. Hours later, the arena was full. Thousands of fans waved light sticks, creating a moving field of color that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The sound was overwhelming even backstage. Every chant traveled through the walls like distant thunder. Jimin stood in position, microphone in hand, listening to the countdown in his earpiece. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The lights exploded. The first note struck the arena and the crowd roared. For several minutes, everything went exactly as planned. The choreography was precise. The cameras moved perfectly. The members exchanged familiar glances between formations. Jimin smiled toward the audience, but beneath that expression was a fatigue he had been hiding since the afternoon. Suga noticed it again during a transition. Their eyes met for barely a second. Jimin gave him a tiny nod, the kind that said, "I'm fine." Suga didn't believe him. Then came the final sequence before the next stage change. Jungkook moved toward Jimin according to the choreography. Their positions were supposed to shift simultaneously, but in the fraction of a second when the lights changed, something went wrong. A movement happened too quickly. A hand made contact. Jimin lost his balance. His foot slipped at the edge of the platform, and suddenly he was falling. The music continued for another beat before the nearest performers realized what had happened. The crowd screamed, not with excitement this time, but with fear. Suga turned instantly. He saw Jimin on the floor. He saw Jungkook standing beside him. And in that single frozen moment before anyone understood the full story, Suga's face changed. The anger came first, then disbelief, then something much deeper, because Suga knew Jimin. And he knew that if Jimin had fallen accidentally, he would probably have been the first person to laugh it off. But Jimin wasn't laughing. He was looking past everyone, toward the far side of the stage, as though he had seen something that nobody else had noticed. That was when Suga understood that the fall might not have been the real emergency. The real emergency had started much earlier. The first person to reach Jimin was not Suga, not Jungkook, and not one of the dancers. It was a stage technician named Daniel who dropped to his knees beside him and whispered, "Don't move yet." Jimin nodded, breathing carefully as the music finally faded and the arena lights shifted into the next sequence. From the audience, the incident looked frightening but brief. Backstage, however, nobody was willing to treat it as ordinary. Suga crouched beside Jimin. "Where does it hurt?" "My ankle, I think." "Think," Suga repeated. Jimin tried to smile. "I can still talk, can't I?" Suga didn't smile back. He looked at Jungkook, who stood several steps away with his face drained of color. "I didn't mean to push him," Jungkook said quietly. Jimin immediately looked up. "You didn't." The words came too quickly. Suga noticed. So did RM, who had just arrived from the opposite side of the stage. "Everyone stay calm," RM said, but his voice carried the tension of someone trying to control a situation that was already slipping beyond his hands. A medical staff member examined Jimin while the members waited nearby. Jungkook kept staring at the floor. "Hyung," he whispered. "I swear I didn't." "I know," Jimin said, but Suga looked at him sharply. "Then why did you look like you were protecting him?" Jimin didn't answer. The room became strangely quiet. Outside, thousands of fans were still cheering, unaware of how serious the atmosphere had become behind the curtain. Then Jimin slowly turned toward the hallway. "Did anyone see the monitor?" he asked. "What monitor?" RM said. Jimin swallowed. "The side stage monitor before I fell," Suga frowned. "Why?" Jimin hesitated. "Because someone was there." Nobody spoke. The medical staff continued checking his ankle, but Jimin's attention remained fixed on the corridor. He wasn't looking for Jungkook. He wasn't looking for a staff member. He was looking for a young woman who had been standing near the equipment cases during rehearsal. Her name was Hana. She was not a celebrity, not a dancer, and not someone the members knew personally. She worked temporarily with the venue's production team, mostly helping organize equipment and backstage materials. To most people, she was invisible, but Jimin had noticed her earlier that afternoon. She had been sitting alone beside a flight case, holding a folded piece of paper with both hands. When Jimin passed her, he had noticed that she quickly hid it. He didn't think much of it then, but just before the performance he had seen her again. This time she was standing near the side stage monitor, crying silently. Jimin had almost approached her, but a staff member called him to position. Now after the fall he couldn't stop thinking about her. "Where is she?" Jimin asked. Suga followed his gaze. "Who?" "The girl from production." A manager looked confused. "Which girl?" Jimin described her jacket, her badge, and where she had been standing. A staff member finally recognized her. "Hana, she left the stage area a few minutes ago." Jimin's expression changed. "Why?" "I don't know." Suga stood slowly. "Find her." The words were quiet but firm. A manager immediately contacted security. Jungkook looked between them, still shaken. "What is happening?" Jimin looked at him. "I don't know yet." That answer frightened Suga more than anything else, because Jimin was usually the person who tried to make sense of chaos. If he was admitting that he didn't know, then there was something much bigger beneath the surface. Minutes later, they found Hana in a narrow service corridor behind the loading area. She was sitting on the floor beside a stack of folded barriers, her head lowered. In her hands was the same piece of paper Jimin had seen earlier. When she noticed the members approaching, she immediately stood. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't be here." Jimin stopped several feet away so he wouldn't overwhelm her. "You don't have to apologize." Hana shook her head. "I caused trouble." "Did you?" Jimin asked gently. She couldn't answer. Suga noticed the paper in her hand. "What's that?" Hana tightened her fingers around it. "Nothing." Jimin glanced at Suga. Suga understood the look immediately. "Don't pressure her." So he simply said, "Okay." That unexpected answer made Hana look up. Her eyes were red. "You don't want to know," Suga replied. "I want to know when you're ready to tell us." For several seconds, only the distant sound of the arena could be heard. Then Hana unfolded the paper. It was a hospital bill, not hers. At the top was the name of a child, her younger brother Minyu. He had been receiving treatment for a serious condition, and Hana had been taking temporary backstage jobs to help her family pay for it. She had been working multiple shifts, sleeping only a few hours, and telling her parents she was managing. But that wasn't the whole story. Jimin looked at the bill and then at Hana. "How long have you been doing this?" "Almost a year. And nobody here knows," she shook her head. "I didn't want anyone to know." Suga's expression softened. "Why?" Hana looked down. "Because people help you once, then they get tired of helping." The sentence landed harder than any dramatic confession could have. Jimin sat carefully on a nearby equipment case despite his injured ankle. "Maybe," he said, "but you shouldn't have to decide that for everyone." Hana wiped her eyes. "I wasn't asking anyone to save me." "I know," Jimin said. "That's why I'm asking what you need." Hana looked at him, and for the first time that night, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. But there was another secret she hadn't told them. The hospital bill wasn't the reason she had been crying near the stage. The real reason was written on the back of that paper, in a message she had received only minutes before the concert began. Her brother's condition had suddenly worsened, and Hana had been standing backstage trying to decide whether to leave her job immediately, knowing that if she did, she might lose the income her family desperately needed. Jimin had seen her crying. He had tried to reach her, and during the performance, when the choreography shifted and Jungkook accidentally collided with him, Jimin's first instinct had not been to protect himself. It had been to look toward Hana. That was why he had fallen the way he did. That was why his eyes had remained fixed on the corridor. And that was why Suga, despite everything that had happened on stage, finally understood that the tears threatening his eyes were not only for Jimin. They were for someone who had been standing silently in the background, carrying a weight nobody had bothered to see. The corridor seemed smaller after Hana told them about her brother. The arena was still roaring on the other side of the concrete wall, but the sound had become distant, almost unreal. Jimin sat quietly on the equipment case, his injured ankle elevated on a folded jacket while a medic continued monitoring him. Suga stood beside him, arms crossed, listening as Hana explained that Minyu was 17 and had spent months moving between hospital rooms, temporary recoveries, and sudden setbacks. Their mother had stopped working to stay with him. Their father had taken extra shifts. Hana had become the person who quietly filled the gaps. "I thought I could handle it," she said. "Then tonight the hospital called." Jimin lowered his eyes. "And you came here anyway." "I needed the money." Her voice almost disappeared. "I couldn't afford to lose another shift." Suga looked toward the floor. There was no judgment in his expression now, only recognition. He understood something about people who kept working while exhausted. "You shouldn't have had to choose between being there for your family and paying for their future," he said. Hana gave a faint, tired smile. "That's how life works sometimes." Before anyone could respond, a security officer hurried into the corridor. "There's a problem at the loading entrance." Everyone turned. "What kind of problem?" RM asked. "A group of reporters heard someone was injured during the performance. They're trying to get information." The manager immediately stepped forward. "Keep them away from this area." Jimin looked uncomfortable. "Don't let this become a story about Jungkook." Jungkook, who had remained silent, looked up. "It was my mistake." Jimin shook his head. "It was an accident. But you fell because I moved too fast." "And I was looking somewhere else," Jimin replied. Jungkook's face tightened. He had spent years learning how to control his movements, his expressions, his breathing, and the smallest details of a performance. Yet one accidental contact had made him feel helpless. Suga noticed his hands trembling. "Jungkook," he said quietly. Jungkook looked at him. "You didn't do it on purpose." "I know." "Then stop punishing yourself before we even understand what happened." Jungkook nodded, but the guilt remained. Meanwhile, Hana's phone began vibrating again. She looked at the screen and immediately stepped away. Jimin saw her expression change. "Is that the hospital?" She nodded. "They need my consent for something." Her hands shook so badly that she almost dropped the phone. "Go," Jimin said. "What?" "Go call them." "But my shift." "Your shift is over." Hana stared at him. "I can't just leave." Jimin glanced at the manager. "Can she?" The manager hesitated, then nodded. "We'll handle it." Hana walked several meters away and answered the call. The members watched her turn her back. Her shoulders rose once, then slowly collapsed. Nobody could hear the conversation, but they didn't need to. When she ended the call, she remained motionless. Suga approached first. "What happened?" Hana turned around. Tears were running down her face. "They said he needs another procedure." Jimin closed his eyes briefly. RM immediately contacted the staff. "Find out what options she has, quietly. No publicity." J-Hope arrived with a bottle of water and a clean towel, having heard only part of the situation. Jin followed with food because, as he later explained, nobody makes good decisions while starving. V stood near Hana without saying anything, simply offering a calm presence. It was a small circle of people, but Hana looked overwhelmed by it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Jimin answered, "Because you shouldn't have to stand alone in a hallway while your family is falling apart." The words were simple. They didn't promise miracles. They didn't pretend money could erase fear. They simply acknowledged what she was carrying. But then another complication arrived. A producer entered the corridor, visibly stressed. "We need to decide whether the concert continues." Everyone became quiet. Jimin immediately said, "I'm fine." Suga looked at him. "You can't walk properly." "I can sit for the next segment." "That's not the point." Jimin tried to stand and winced. The producer looked worried. "If you stop the show, people outside may panic." Jimin stared toward the arena. Thousands of fans had traveled long distances. Some had waited for hours. Some may have saved for months to be there. But he also knew that pretending everything was fine would be dishonest. "Give us 10 minutes, RM said. "We'll decide." The producer left. Suga crouched beside Jimin. "You don't have to prove anything tonight." Jimin whispered, "I know." "Then why are you trying?" Jimin looked toward Hana. "Because she came to work tonight thinking she had no choice. I don't want her to feel like everyone has no choice." Suga stared at him for several seconds, then his expression softened. "You always make things harder than they need to be." Jimin smiled faintly. "You still came after me." "Of course I did." The answer came without hesitation. For a moment, the tension lifted. Then Hana's phone rang again. This time it was her mother. Hana answered, and within seconds her face went pale. She whispered, "I'm coming." She ended the call and looked at Jimin. "I'm sorry, I have to go." Jimin nodded, "Then go. But what about the concert? We'll handle it." She hesitated. "I can't repay you." Suga shook his head. "Nobody asked you to." Hana looked at them, then hurried toward the exit. But before she disappeared, she turned back. "Jimin." He looked up. "Thank you for noticing." The sentence stopped him completely. Because that was what this entire night had become about. Not the fall, not the cameras, not the accident. Someone had simply noticed. Yet outside, the story was already beginning to spread. Fans had seen Jimin fall. Clips were appearing online. Rumors were multiplying. Some blamed Jungkook. Some worried about Jimin. Others demanded explanations. None of them knew about Hana. None of them knew about the hospital. And none of them knew that while the internet argued over who had pushed whom, Jimin was sitting backstage wondering whether the person who had truly been pushed that night was someone nobody had been looking at all. The decision came without applause, cameras, or anything that resembled a grand announcement. It happened in a quiet backstage room while the arena outside continued to tremble with thousands of voices. Jimin sat with his ankle wrapped, staring at the floor. Suga stood near the window, arms folded, watching the lights of the city through a narrow gap in the curtain. RM had the concert producer on the phone. Jin was checking whether Hana had reached the hospital. J-Hope was speaking with the dancers about rearranging the next sequence. V sat silently beside Jungkook, who still looked as though he was carrying the entire accident on his shoulders. Then Jimin said something that made everyone stop. "Cancel my solo." The room went still. "What?" RM asked. "My solo stage, replace it with something else." "Jimin, you don't have to decide that now." "I already did." Suga turned from the window. "Why?" Jimin looked at him. "Because I can't perform like nothing happened. Nobody is asking you to pretend, but the audience is waiting." "Then let them wait." Jimin shook his head. "That's not how concerts work." Suga walked toward him. "And that's not how people work either." Jimin looked up. For a moment neither spoke. Then Suga lowered his voice. "You saw someone in trouble, you tried to reach them, you fell, now you're injured and you're still worried about whether everyone else is disappointed." Jimin's eyes dropped. "What am I supposed to do? Be honest." Jimin took a slow breath. What if honesty makes everything worse? Suga replied. Then we deal with what comes after. That sentence became the turning point. Staff were instructed to pause the planned sequence. No dramatic announcement was made. No personal details about Hana were shared. The concert would continue, but Jimin would not perform the physically demanding solo. Instead, the members would appear together for an acoustic segment. Before returning to the stage, however, Jimin asked for one thing. Can we check on Hana? A manager confirmed that she had reached the hospital. Her brother had been taken into another procedure. Jimin closed his eyes. Okay, Suga placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. You did what you could. It doesn't feel like enough. It rarely does. Meanwhile, Jungkook stood near the door. Hyung, Jimin looked at him. I'm sorry. Jimin smiled faintly. I know. I keep thinking if I had moved half a second later, then we'd be talking about a different half second. Jungkook looked down. I hate that I hurt you. Jimin reached out and pulled him into a brief embrace. You didn't hurt me on purpose. Jungkook's eyes filled. But I still saw you fall. Then remember what happened after, Jimin said. You didn't run away. The words mattered. Jungkook nodded. He understood that courage was not always preventing something from going wrong. Sometimes it was staying when you were afraid to face what had gone wrong. The members returned to the stage together. The arena lights softened. Jimin walked carefully, supported subtly by Suga. The audience noticed immediately. A wave of concern moved through the venue. Instead of pretending nothing had happened, RM addressed the crowd without revealing anything private. Tonight didn't go exactly as planned, he said, but sometimes the most important moments are the ones we don't plan. The crowd responded with a warm roar. Jimin smiled. He looked across the sea of lights and saw thousands of faces staring back. Then he noticed something unexpected, a small sign near the front that read, "It's okay to rest." He stared at it for a second longer than usual. Suga followed his gaze. See, he whispered. Someone understands. Jimin nodded. The acoustic performance began. No elaborate choreography, no dramatic effects, just voices, instruments, and the sound of people listening. During the final song, Jimin looked towards Suga. There was something in his expression that Suga recognized immediately. Gratitude. Not because Suga had saved him from falling, but because he had refused to let the fall become the only thing that mattered. When the song ended, the audience rose. Jimin bowed slowly. Suga remained beside him. The applause lasted longer than anyone expected. But while the arena celebrated, Hana sat alone in a hospital corridor several kilometers away, waiting for a doctor to come through a set of double doors. She had no idea what had happened on stage after she left. She didn't know that thousands of people were talking about Jimin's fall. She didn't know that the members had changed the concert because of what she had told them. She only knew that her brother was still in surgery. Then, just after midnight, a doctor finally appeared. Hana stood immediately. Doctor, the doctor removed his mask. The procedure went as well as we could have hoped. Hana covered her mouth with both hands. Her knees almost gave way. She leaned against the wall and began crying, not from fear this time, but from relief. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. You don't have to answer tonight, just know that you're not alone. Hana stared at the screen for several seconds. She didn't know who had sent it. Then another message arrived. Rest, we'll talk tomorrow. She smiled through her tears. Back at the venue, Suga sat alone in the dressing room after the concert. The adrenaline had faded. The room was almost silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Jimin entered slowly. Still awake? Suga asked. You too. Jimin sat beside him. For several seconds they said nothing. Then Suga whispered, when you fell I thought. He stopped. Jimin waited. I thought I was going to lose you. Jimin looked at him. Suga quickly wiped his eyes, almost embarrassed. Don't make a big deal out of it. Jimin smiled softly. You cried. No, you did. My eyes were tired. Jimin laughed quietly. Suga looked away, but this time he didn't hide the tears. I don't know why that scared me so much, he admitted. Jimin leaned his head against Suga's shoulder. Because you care. Suga gave a small, broken laugh. That's inconvenient. Very. They stayed there in silence. Outside, the last fans were leaving the arena. Staff were dismantling the stage. The lights that had filled the venue only hours earlier were disappearing one by one. And somewhere in the city, Hana was sitting beside her brother's hospital bed, watching his breathing become steady. 3 separate rooms. 3 different kinds of silence. Yet somehow they were connected by the same thing. Someone had finally stopped long enough to notice another person's pain, and the next morning the consequences would begin. Years from now, many people would remember fragments of that interview. Some would recall the silence that unexpectedly filled a brightly lit studio. Others would remember seeing Suga's tears or the moment he instinctively embraced Jimin without caring who was watching. A few would remember the unfinished questions, the empty chairs left behind on the stage, or the mystery that surrounded their sudden departure. Yet those details, powerful as they once seemed, were never the true heart of the story. The real story had always existed beyond the cameras, beyond the headlines, and beyond the curiosity of millions. It lived inside a simple promise made to a frightened child who wanted nothing more than to believe that kindness could be trusted. It lived inside a friendship that had matured enough to recognize pain before it was spoken aloud. And it lived inside the quiet decision to choose compassion over convenience, even when the world expected something entirely different. Looking back, Jimin often realized that his greatest mistake had never been caring too much. His mistake had been believing that love required loneliness, that protecting the people around him meant carrying every burden by himself. It was an understandable belief, one shared by countless people who feared becoming a source of worry for those they loved. But that afternoon changed him forever. He discovered that genuine strength does not grow from silent suffering. It grows from allowing trusted hands to reach toward you when your own have become too tired to keep holding on. Suga, too, carried that lesson with him. Throughout his life, he had expressed affection more through actions than words, believing quiet presence often spoke louder than dramatic declarations. Yet the tears he shed that day never embarrassed him. They reminded him that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. Sometimes it is its clearest expression. By allowing himself to cry openly for someone he loved, he unknowingly gave others permission to believe that compassion has no reason to hide behind pride. The other members carried their own reflections. RM often spoke privately about leadership, not as the ability to solve every problem, but as the willingness to walk beside others when solutions did not yet exist. Jin continued using humor to brighten difficult days, understanding that laughter can coexist with sorrow without diminishing either. J-Hope never stopped believing that hope is not created by ignoring pain, but by refusing to abandon people because of it. V continued finding beauty in overlooked places, convinced that ordinary moments often become life's most unforgettable memories. Jungkook learned that growing stronger sometimes means asking for help rather than trying to prove you never need it. Together, they discovered that family is not defined by never struggling. Family is revealed by who quietly remains beside you when struggle arrives without warning. As for Yuna, her story continued long after hospital rooms became distant memories. She grew older carrying with her the drawing that had once hung above her bed. The paper became worn, its colors faded by time, but she never replaced it. Whenever people asked why she treasured something so simple, she smiled and answered with quiet certainty, "Because it reminds me that promises don't become powerful when they're perfect. They become powerful when people choose each other, even when keeping them is difficult." Those words stayed with everyone who heard them. They spread naturally from one conversation to another, never through grand speeches, but through everyday acts of kindness that rarely appear in history books. Somewhere, a parent decided to spend one more hour beside a child's bedside. Somewhere else, an old friend finally made the phone call they had postponed for months. A stranger offered encouragement instead of judgment. A volunteer visited someone who believed they had been forgotten. None of those moments made international news. None required applause. Yet together they quietly transformed lives in ways impossible to measure. Perhaps that is how genuine compassion has always worked. It rarely arrives with dramatic music or perfect timing. More often, it appears as a hand resting gently on a trembling shoulder, a conversation held after everyone else has gone home, a promise kept despite inconvenience, or an embrace given before anyone asks for one. These gestures seem small while they are happening, yet years later they become the memories people carry when everything else has faded. In the end, this story was never truly about fame, interviews, or even the unexpected confession that left an entire studio speechless. Those were only the circumstances that allowed something far more meaningful to emerge. At its heart, this was a story about choosing to see what others overlook, about listening closely enough to hear the pain hidden beneath polite smiles, and about understanding that no act of kindness is ever wasted simply because it happens away from the spotlight. Every person, regardless of where they come from or who they are, will one day encounter someone silently carrying a burden too heavy to hold alone. In that moment, we each face a quiet choice. We can continue walking, assuming someone else will notice, or we can stop, sit beside them and remind them, through words, through presence, or simply through unwavering companionship, that they no longer have to carry everything by themselves. Sometimes that single decision becomes the beginning of a story whose ending reaches far beyond anything we could ever imagine. And perhaps the most enduring legacy of all is this. Long after the applause fades, the cameras stop recording and memories begin to blur. People will rarely remember every word we said, but they will remember how we made them feel when they needed someone most. That is the kind of promise worth keeping. That is the kind of friendship worth protecting. And that is the quiet power of choosing compassion, one heart at a time. Hyung, she's gone. Jimin's trembling voice shattered the quiet inside the recording studio just moments before rehearsal began. Suga immediately stood up, his face turning pale as he stared at the folded envelope clutched tightly in Jimin's shaking hands. "No," he whispered, unable to believe the words he had just heard. Jimin slowly unfolded the letter, revealing familiar handwriting that instantly filled his eyes with tears. "She told us not to cry," he said, his voice breaking. Before anyone else could react, Suga wrapped both arms around Jimin once again, holding him as though letting go would make the loss real. But when they finally opened the letter together, they discovered something so unexpected that every member of BTS stood frozen in complete silence. Was Yuna's final wish really about saying goodbye? Or had she quietly left behind one last promise that would change countless lives forever? Stay until the end of this story and tell us honestly in the comments. If someone you loved left you one final letter, would you have the courage to fulfill their last wish, no matter how difficult it was? The morning after the letter arrived, Seoul seemed unusually quiet. A thin layer of rain covered the city streets, turning the reflections of buildings and passing cars into soft waves of silver beneath the gray sky. Inside the HYBE practice building, the familiar sounds of music, footsteps, and conversations that usually filled the halls were replaced by a rare silence. The members had gathered in one of the smaller practice rooms, not the large studio used for performances, but a more private space where they had spent countless nights during their earliest days together. The room still carried memories from years before, old speakers in the corner, handwritten notes attached to the walls, and faint marks on the floor from endless rehearsals. It was a place where they had celebrated victories, faced disappointments, and reminded each other why they continued moving forward. Today, however, nobody was there to practice choreography or prepare for a performance. They were there because of a promise. Jimin sat near the window, holding the same envelope he had received that morning. The paper had become slightly wrinkled because he had gripped it so tightly since opening it. Across from him, Suga sat quietly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Neither of them had slept much. The others understood without needing explanations. RM placed his phone on the table after turning off all notifications. Jin brought food, but nobody touched it. J-Hope sat beside Jimin, offering silent support. V looked through the rain-covered window, while Jungkook carefully arranged the documents related to Yuna's treatment and family information. They were no longer simply remembering a child they had met. They were preparing to honor someone who had changed the way they saw kindness itself. The letter had been delivered by Yuna's parents 3 days earlier. They had waited until the members had finished their major schedules because they didn't want to interrupt their work. Inside the envelope was a small collection of drawings, photographs, and one handwritten message. The handwriting was still recognizable, the same uneven letters from the drawing that once hung beside her hospital bed. Jimin had opened the letter alone first. He had expected sadness. He had expected goodbye. But what he found was something completely different. Yuna had written about the day they visited her at the hospital. She described how she had been afraid before meeting them, not because of her illness, but because she thought people always left when things became difficult. Then she wrote about what she learned from Jimin and Suga. I used to think strong people never cry, but Suga showed me that strong people cry because they care, and Jimin showed me that promises are not about being perfect. They are about trying. Those words were the reason Jimin had broken down that morning. Not because they reminded him of loss, but because they reminded him of the responsibility left behind. The letter continued with a request that nobody expected. Yuna didn't ask for flowers. She didn't ask for a memorial. She didn't ask anyone to remember her as someone who was sick. Instead, she asked them to create a place where children who felt forgotten could share their dreams. A small room. A place with books, music, art supplies, and a window where children could watch the sky. A place where nobody would feel alone while waiting for tomorrow. When Jimin finished reading the letter aloud, the practice room remained silent for several minutes. No one immediately responded because the request carried something much larger than a simple project. It carried Yuna's entire belief about what people could become when they chose to care for one another. Finally, RM spoke quietly. She didn't want people to remember how much she suffered. He looked around the room. She wanted people to remember what she loved. Suga lowered his head, staring at the letter resting on the table. She was younger than all of us, he said softly, but somehow she understood something we kept forgetting. Jimin looked at him. What? Suga took a slow breath before answering. That being there for someone is sometimes the greatest thing you can give. Outside the window, the rain continued falling, but inside the room something slowly changed. The sadness remained. Nobody tried to erase it. They understood that missing someone was part of loving them, but alongside that sadness appeared something else, a determination to turn grief into action. The members began discussing how they could fulfill Yuna's final wish while respecting her family's privacy. No cameras, no announcements, no attempt to create a public image. Just a promise between people who believed one person's kindness could continue spreading even after they were gone. However, as they began making plans, they discovered that fulfilling Yuna's dream would not be as simple as they imagined. There were challenges they had not expected, disagreements about the best way to help, and emotional moments when the reality of losing someone they cared about became too heavy to ignore. And somewhere beyond the walls of that practice room, thousands of other children were waiting for the same thing Yuna had wanted most. A place where someone would simply sit beside them and say, "You are not alone." In the weeks that followed, the story of Jimin's fall slowly faded from headlines, but the people involved carried its consequences in quieter ways. Jimin returned to rehearsals gradually, refusing to rush his recovery. The first time he stepped back onto the practice floor, the room became unusually silent. Jungkook watched him carefully. Jimin noticed and smiled. "Stop starring." Jungkook laughed nervously. "I'm checking if you're okay." "I'm okay." Suga, sitting near the sound system, looked up. "He's lying." Everyone laughed. The tension finally broke. The choreography was modified slightly, not because anyone feared the same accident would happen again, but because the members had learned something about paying attention to one another. Jungkook stopped treating every movement like a potential disaster. Jimin stopped pretending that pain was something he always had to hide. Suga, perhaps most noticeably, became more willing to say what he felt before it turned into silence. One evening after rehearsal, Jungkook approached him. "Hi, Young." Suga looked over. "What?" "Thank you." Suga frowned. "For what?" "For not making me feel like a terrible person." Suga was quiet for a moment. "You made a mistake, that's different." Jungkook nodded. "I know. And if you keep punishing yourself forever, then you're making another mistake." Jungkook smiled. "You're strangely wise sometimes. Don't tell anyone." Across town, Hana's life had also begun to change, though not in the dramatic way people might imagine. There was no instant transformation. Bills still arrived. Minyu still had appointments. Their parents were still exhausted. Hana still worked. But she stopped hiding everything. She asked for help when she needed it. She began speaking with her supervisor about more stable work. Most importantly, she started spending time with Minyu without constantly checking her phone for the next crisis. One evening, Minyu found her sitting at the kitchen table staring at a notebook. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing." "About what?" "The hospital program." Minyu sat beside her. "Are you going to sing again?" Hana smiled. "Maybe. You should." "Why?" "Because you're better when you're not pretending." She looked at him and laughed. "Who taught you to talk like that?" "A singer who fell off a stage." Hana laughed harder. It was the kind of laughter that came from relief rather than amusement. The hospital program continued once a month. It became larger, but Hana refused to let it become commercialized. She wanted it to remain a place where children could make mistakes without feeling ashamed. Jimin occasionally sent recorded encouragement when his schedule prevented him from attending. Suga preferred handwritten notes. He rarely wrote more than a few sentences, but Hana kept every one. One of them said, "You don't need to be strong every day." She taped it above her desk. Meanwhile, the members themselves never completely forgot the night. RM became more attentive to staff welfare during long schedules. J-Hope began checking on dancers who stayed behind after rehearsals. Jin started carrying extra food backstage and insisted that everyone eat before difficult performances. V quietly began asking crew members how they were doing instead of simply asking whether everything was ready. Jungkook changed in a different way. He became less afraid of mistakes. During one rehearsal, he missed a transition and immediately froze. Then he laughed. "Okay, that was terrible." Jimin laughed too. "Very." Jungkook bowed dramatically. "Thank you for your honesty." The room filled with laughter. It was small but meaningful. He had finally learned that an accident didn't have to become an identity. Suga's change was quieter. One night, Jimin found him sitting alone in a recording studio. "Still working?" Jimin asked. "Always." Jimin sat down. "What are you writing?" Suga hesitated. "Something about silence." Jimin smiled. "That sounds like you." Suga looked at him. "Maybe." Jimin noticed a folded photograph on the desk. It was the picture from the hospital corridor. Hana, Minyu, Jimin, and Suga. "You kept it." "Yeah." "Why?" Suga looked at the photograph for a long time. "Because I want to remember what almost got lost in all the noise." Jimin understood. The fall had become a viral clip. Millions of people had watched a few seconds of footage and formed opinions. Some blamed Jungkook. Some defended him. Some speculated about Jimin's condition. Others created theories that had nothing to do with reality. But none of them had seen the hallway. None had seen Hana's hands shaking around a hospital bill. None had seen Suga sitting beside Jimin after everyone had gone home. The internet had seen an accident. The people inside the story had seen a warning. A warning that behind every public moment were private lives carrying things nobody could see. Months later, Jimin received an invitation to speak at the hospital program. He initially wanted to decline. "I'm not good at speeches," he told Suga. "You're good at talking. That's different. You'll be fine." On the day of the event, Jimin stood in front of a small group of patients, families, nurses, and staff. There were no giant screens, no dramatic lighting. Just a microphone and a room full of ordinary people. He looked toward Hana, who was sitting beside Minyu. "I used to think kindness meant doing something big," Jimin said. "Now I think sometimes it's much smaller. Sometimes it's sitting beside someone. Sometimes it's asking a second question. Sometimes it's staying 5 minutes longer." He paused. "And sometimes it's allowing someone to help you." Suga watched from the back of the room. He smiled. After the speech, a young boy approached Jimin. "Did you really fall?" Jimin laughed. "Yes." "Did it hurt?" "A little." "Were you scared?" Jimin looked at Suga before answering. "Yes." The boy nodded. "Me too." Jimin crouched down. "That's okay." The boy smiled and walked away. Suga watched him go. The moment reminded him that courage had never meant being fearless. It meant admitting fear without allowing it to control the next decision. Later that evening, Hana gave Jimin another envelope. Inside was a new photograph. Minyu was standing on his own now, thinner than before but smiling. Hana stood beside him. On the back she had written, "He asked me to tell you he's more careful now." Jimin laughed. Suga read it over his shoulder. Smart kid, Hana smiled. He also said you should be more careful, Jimin sighed. Everyone keeps saying that, Suga laughed. For the first time, the memory of the fall no longer felt like an open wound. It had become something else. A reminder, a scar. A story that no longer belonged to the moment of impact, but to everything that came afterward. And perhaps that was the most realistic consequence of all. Life did not suddenly become perfect. Nobody was magically cured of fear. Nobody escaped every future hardship. But they became slightly better at noticing one another. And sometimes, that was enough to change what happened next. A year passed before anyone realized how far that single night had traveled. There was no anniversary announcement, no headline reminding the public of the accident, and no attempt to turn the story into something larger than it was. Yet small changes had quietly continued. Hana's hospital program had become a permanent monthly gathering supported by local volunteers. What began with a handful of children now included patients, siblings, parents, nurses, and young performers who simply needed a place where they could be imperfect without being judged. Hana no longer introduced herself as someone who was struggling to survive. She had become one of the people helping others survive difficult seasons of their own. Minyu returned to school part-time. His recovery was slow and there were setbacks, but he had regained enough strength to complain about homework again, which Hana considered one of the best signs imaginable. Jimin kept the original photograph in the same notebook. Whenever his schedule became overwhelming, he would occasionally open it and remember the hospital corridor. Suga kept his own copy inside a folder in his studio. He never displayed it publicly. It was too personal for that. One evening, months after the concert, Jimin found Suga staring at it. "You still look at that?" Jimin asked. "Sometimes." "Why?" Suga thought for a moment. "Because it reminds me that the moment everyone remembers isn't always the moment that matters most." Jimin nodded. "The fall." "Exactly. People still talk about it sometimes. People talk about what they can see." Jimin smiled. "And we know what they didn't." Their friendship had changed subtly after that night, not dramatically. They didn't suddenly become more emotional or start having deep conversations every day. Instead, they became more attentive to the small things. If Jimin became unusually quiet, Suga noticed. If Suga stayed in the studio too late, Jimin would leave food outside the door without saying anything. Sometimes they would sit together without talking. The silence itself became a form of communication. Jungkook also carried the memory differently. The guilt eventually became less painful, but it never disappeared completely. During one interview months later, a reporter casually mentioned the old incident and asked whether he was still worried about performing beside Jimin. Jungkook paused before answering. "I learned that being careful doesn't mean being afraid," he said. "It means trusting the people around you enough to keep moving." The answer was brief. He didn't explain the private story behind it. He didn't need to. RM, sitting nearby, gave him a quiet nod. The members had learned that some memories belonged to them alone. Meanwhile, Hana's story had begun influencing people who had never met her. A nurse at the hospital started a small initiative encouraging staff to ask one extra question when a patient seemed unusually quiet. Not, "Are you okay?" but, "What do you need today?" It sounded insignificant. Yet patients began opening up. Parents admitted when they were exhausted. Teenagers confessed when they were afraid. Staff members began supporting one another more openly. Nobody called it a revolution. It was simply a better habit. And habits, repeated long enough, can change the atmosphere of an entire place. One afternoon, Jimin received a message from Hana. It contained a photograph of a new sign outside the hospital program room. The words were simple: "You are allowed to be seen." Jimin stared at the photograph for several seconds before sending it to Suga. Suga replied almost immediately, "That's better than anything we could have written." Jimin smiled. The legacy wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about one famous person helping someone ordinary. In fact, Hana eventually stopped describing the story that way. "They didn't save me," she told a volunteer. "They reminded me that I could let people stand beside me." That distinction mattered, because the most dangerous version of kindness is the kind that creates dependence. Real compassion gives people room to regain their own strength. Hana had done exactly that. She built something that belonged to her. She created a place where other people could be noticed. Years later, a young performer who had attended one of the earliest hospital events would remember Jimin's words about making mistakes. She would eventually audition for a small local theater company. During her first performance, she forgot an entire line. For one terrible second, she froze. Then she remembered something she had heard in that hospital room years earlier. "You don't have to be perfect to continue." She smiled, improvised, and kept going. Afterward, she called Hana. "I messed up," Hana laughed, "and I finished." "Then you didn't fail." That conversation would become another small thread in the story. Nobody would write an article about it. Nobody would know the names involved. But that was the point. The impact of the night had spread in ways no algorithm could measure. One person noticed another. That person learned to ask for help. Someone else learned not to fear mistakes. A nurse learned to ask a better question. A teenager learned that embarrassment wasn't the end of a dream. A family learned they didn't have to carry every burden privately. And somewhere inside a recording studio, Suga continued writing. He never released the song inspired by that night. It remained unfinished for a long time. One evening, Jimin walked in and found him listening to the same instrumental again. "Still not finished?" Jimin asked. "No." "Why?" Suga smiled faintly. "Because I don't think it needs an ending yet." Jimin understood. Some stories didn't end when the credits rolled. They continued in choices people made afterward. Suga closed the laptop. "You know what I remember most?" "What?" "Not the fall." Jimin looked at him. "Then what?" Suga answered quietly. "The moment you looked at her." Jimin was silent. "You were hurt," Suga continued, "but you were still looking for someone else." Jimin smiled. "Maybe that's why I fell." Suga shook his head. "Maybe," he paused, "or maybe you just missed a step." They both laughed. It was a strangely ordinary ending to a story that had once felt enormous. And perhaps that was exactly what made it meaningful. The event did not transform the world. It transformed a few people. Those people changed a few more. And somewhere along the way, kindness stopped being a dramatic gesture and became a habit. The photograph remained. The memory remained. The scar remained. But so did the laughter, the music, the hospital room, the handwritten notes, the small performances, and the quiet realization that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away. Years later, Jimin would sometimes remember the sound before he remembered the fall. Not the scream of the crowd, not the sudden movement, not even Suga's trembling voice. He remembered the strange silence that followed, the brief moment when thousands of people seemed to disappear and all he could see was one person standing alone with tears in her eyes. The memory had changed over time. At first, it had been frightening. Then it had become confusing. Eventually, it became a reminder. Jimin never forgot that he had been surrounded by people that night. Yet somehow the most important thing he noticed was someone who felt completely alone. Suga remembered something different. He remembered fear. Real fear. The kind that arrives before the mind has time to explain it. He remembered seeing Jimin on the floor and realizing that no amount of experience, preparation, fame, or confidence could guarantee that the people you loved would never get hurt. What mattered was what you did after the unexpected happened. You could blame someone. You could freeze. You could walk away. Or you could stay. Suga chose to stay. Jungkook learned that an accident did not make him a bad person, just as Jimin's fall did not make him weak. Hana learned that asking for help did not erase her strength. Minyu learned that recovery was not measured by how quickly someone returned to normal, but by how many times they were willing to begin again. And the other members learned something that never appeared in a headline. Sometimes caring for someone doesn't require words at all. Sometimes it is a bottle of water placed quietly beside them, a meal left on a table, a hand on a shoulder, a decision to wait, a question asked twice because the first answer didn't sound true. The world often remembers dramatic moments because they are easy to capture. A fall, a scream, a tear, a photograph, but human beings are rarely changed by 1 second alone. They are changed by what happens in the minutes, hours, and days afterward. That was the part no camera captured. The hospital corridor after midnight, the empty dressing room, the quiet conversation between two friends who were too tired to pretend, The young woman sitting beside her brother's bed, the children singing imperfectly in a small room, the laughter that returned after fear had taken it away. Those were the moments that mattered, and perhaps that is why the story never truly belonged to the fall. The fall was only the beginning. The real story was what everyone chose to do after it. In a world where people are often judged by the few seconds others happen to see, there is something powerful about remembering that every person carries an invisible chapter. The person who looks distant may be exhausted. The person who keeps smiling may be afraid. The person who says, "I'm fine," may be hoping someone will ask again. We cannot know every struggle. We cannot rescue everyone. We cannot fix every wound, but we can notice. We can listen. We can stay a little longer. We can make room for someone else's fear without making them ashamed of it. And sometimes that small act is enough to change the direction of a life. The fictional story of Jimin, Suga, Jungkook, Hana, and Minyu was never meant to suggest that pain is necessary for kindness, or that every difficult moment will magically lead to something beautiful. Real life is messier than that. Some wounds take years. Some questions never receive satisfying answers. Some people leave before we are ready. But even in that uncertainty, human connection remains one of the few things capable of making a difficult road feel less lonely. Perhaps that is what Suga understood when he cried that night. He wasn't crying because Jimin had fallen. He was crying because, for one terrifying second, he understood how easily someone precious could disappear from your reach. And perhaps Jimin understood something too. Being strong did not mean standing alone. Sometimes strength was allowing someone to stand beside you. Years later, the photograph from the hospital still existed. It wasn't famous. It wasn't displayed in a museum or shared millions of times online. It simply sat inside a drawer, slightly faded at the edges. 4 people stood in it: Jimin, Suga, Hana, and Minyu. Nobody was posing perfectly. Nobody looked glamorous. The lighting was ordinary. The smiles were tired. But if you looked closely, you could see something the photograph had captured without trying: relief. The relief of people who had survived a difficult night and discovered they did not have to carry its weight alone. And maybe that is the image worth remembering. Not a superstar on a stage. Not a shocking fall. Not an argument about who pushed whom. Just people. People making mistakes. People feeling fear. People crying. People helping. People healing. Because in the end, the most meaningful moments are often not the ones that make the most noise. They are the ones that quietly teach us how to treat one another when nobody is watching. So if you ever find yourself standing beside someone who suddenly says, "I'm fine," and something inside you tells you that they aren't, perhaps ask one more time. Sit down. Listen. Don't demand an explanation. Don't promise to fix everything. Just let them know they don't have to disappear behind their smile. And if you are the person who is struggling, remember this: accepting a hand does not make you weak. Resting does not mean you have failed. Asking for help does not erase everything you've survived. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you cannot carry everything alone. That night began with a fall. It ended with people learning how to stand beside one another. And maybe when all the lights disappear, when the crowd goes home, when the cameras stop recording, that is the part of every story that matters most. Not who fell, not who was blamed, but who stayed. 2 years after that night, the memory of the fall had almost disappeared from the public conversation. New concerts had happened, new songs had been released, new headlines had replaced the old ones. But for Jimin, there were moments when a familiar sound, a microphone dropping, a sudden gasp from a crowd, the sharp echo of shoes against a stage, could still take him back to that night. He never told anyone that sometimes he still remembered Suga's face before he remembered his own pain. Not the anger, not even the tears, just the fear in Suga's eyes. One rainy evening, Jimin found himself standing alone inside an empty rehearsal hall. The lights were dim, and rain traced thin lines down the windows. He looked at the center of the floor where he had practiced the same choreography countless times. Then he heard footsteps behind him. "You always come here when you can't sleep," Jimin smiled. "You noticed?" Suga walked beside him. "I notice more than you think." They stood silently for a while. "Do you ever regret that night?" Jimin finally asked. Suga thought about it. "I regret that you got hurt. That's not what I asked. Suga looked at him. Then no. Jimin seemed surprised. No, because if that night had never happened, maybe we wouldn't have noticed what we were missing. Jimin lowered his eyes. You mean Hana, her, us, everyone? Suga paused. Sometimes something has to interrupt the routine before people realize they've been walking past each other. Jimin smiled faintly. That sounds like something you'd write in a song. Maybe I did. Jimin looked at him. You finished it, Suga nodded. Finally. What's it called? Suga smiled. I called it Stay. Jimin laughed softly. Of course you did. His phone vibrated, a message from Hana. It contained a photograph of the hospital program's newest group of children performing on the same small stage where she had once been too frightened to sing. Minyu stood at the side, helping with the microphones. Hana had become one of the program's coordinators. The children were laughing. One little boy had forgotten his lyrics and was making up words instead. Jimin stared at the picture for a long time. She's doing well, he said. Yeah, Suga replied. She is. Another message arrived. This one was from Jungkook. Are you two still talking about that night? Jimin laughed. How does he know? Suga shrugged. Because he's Jungkook, they called him. His face appeared on the screen, smiling. I knew it, Jungkook said. You two are still sentimental. You're the sentimental one, Jimin replied. I'm not. You cried during a children's performance last month. Dust, Suga laughed. In an indoor hospital, Jungkook pointed at the screen. Exactly, very dangerous dust. They laughed together. It was ordinary, almost boring, and that was precisely what made it beautiful. The night that had once divided their emotions into fear, guilt, anger, and uncertainty had eventually become a memory they could talk about without being consumed by it. Jimin looked around the empty rehearsal room. You know what I learned? Suga waited. We spend so much time trying to make every performance perfect. He looked at the floor. But the moments people remember aren't always the perfect ones. Suga nodded. Sometimes they're the moments when something goes wrong. And someone stays, Suga smiled. Exactly. The rain outside became heavier. Neither of them moved toward the door. They simply stood there listening. Somewhere far away, a stage crew was probably preparing another concert. Somewhere fans were waiting behind barriers. Somewhere a child was preparing to sing in front of a small audience. Somewhere Hana was probably telling someone not to be embarrassed about making a mistake. And somewhere inside a hospital room, Minyu was probably complaining about his medication. Life had continued, not perfectly, not without pain, but forward. Jimin took the old photograph from his wallet. The edges were worn now. He looked at it one last time before putting it away. Do you think people would believe this story? He asked. Suga shook his head. They don't have to. Why? Because it isn't really about them. Jimin looked at him. Then who is it about? Suga answered quietly. Anyone who has ever been afraid to say they weren't okay. Jimin nodded. The lights in the rehearsal room clicked off automatically, leaving only the pale glow from the windows. They walked toward the exit together. Neither looked back. The floor behind them was empty. The place where Jimin had once practiced the movement that led to the fall was nothing more than a patch of polished wood. But the meaning of that space had changed. It was no longer where someone had fallen. It was where people had learned to look up. And perhaps that is the quietest truth hidden inside every painful memory. Sometimes we cannot change what happened. We cannot rewind the second before the mistake. We cannot erase the fear, the tears, or the questions that followed. But we can choose what the next moment means. We can turn guilt into understanding, fear into attention, pain into compassion, and a fall into a reason to stay. The door closed behind Jimin and Suga. The rehearsal room became completely silent. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights outside flickered across the empty floor as if the room itself were remembering. And somewhere beyond those walls, life continued, messy, imperfect, unfinished, but still moving forward.